Hello, this is Channel 1 with your hosts Khadijah, Asaya, Ty, Payola, and Morgan. Evolution, as we know it, is always evolving. And from many years ago, evolution has been presented in theses by ecologists and scientists who study species and different taxonomies. Some examples Darwin used will relate precisely to this topic on evolution to prove evolution true. And despite having input from other scientists, Darwin set out to prove and test each hypothesis and opinion until all was worthy of this proclamation. That is the proclamation that without natural selection, variation, and domestication, evolution cannot withstand the detrimental effect of evolving. Now we'll hear from Morgan on the arguments and evidence presented on this topic.
Chapter 1 of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin mainly focuses on how domestication plays a large role in the variability and variation we see in species today. And it starts out by saying that the reproductive system is where the highest cause of variability is, and Darwin states that it's just because that this is the most susceptible part of all animals and plants to variations. And he kind of goes into how there are some laws that regulate variation, just saying that any changes in the embryo obviously will result in changes in the mature animal, as well as if they breed them under confinement in domestication as opposed to the wild, you can see these variations. You could play a large role in changing them. He does talk about how if they are domesticated and they revert to the wild, then many of them often can't return to their original state. And kind of argues that the species we see now are due to the domestication of, he brings up sheep or cows, and even goes to say that he thinks that all dogs came from one species. But the large focus of this argument goes to pigeons. Just saying that, a lot of the pigeons that we think, and most species that he knows, he thinks came from one specific species of pigeon, the rock pigeon in Colombia, and he has lots of evidence talking about similarities in skeletal structure and facial bones, and that he thinks that, domesticating them all over the world for different purposes, and the environmental played the large impact on where their variations came from, such as different facial bones or jaws or vertebrae, or the way their tail feathers flare, or the colors that they present. And it kind of goes into how cross selection, like the Mendelian cross, he brings it up, and how two parents will yield an intermediate, which necessarily isn't a new species, but it is variation, and that this does kind of impact pigeons. But he thinks that, the selection of these pigeons for their traits that people used all over the place were a larger impact on why those pigeons, like the rock pigeon, are so different. And he also, his largest indication between why these pigeons must have come from the same common ancestor was that there's a fertility between all the mixes of the pigeons. And he basically says, in essence, that selection is more prevalent whenever the variation or the species is useful to man. So if they're a species of like a gooseberry species, he mentions cabbage or gooseberries produce similar fruits and stems. These kind of species obviously get improved by breeders, or some sheep species get improved by breeders for these traits. And this artificial selection can be one of two ways. And basically it can be methodical, which is where there's a distinct object in view to make a new superior breed. So they're specifically breeding for that specific trait to better the species. But there's also unconscious selection, where everyone basically tries to possess that best species. So they're unconsciously keeping those genes, which he doesn't ever mention genes, but they're unconsciously keeping those animals breeding for that purpose, which is why we see the traits that we see today, such as Buckley and Burgess sheep, Arab stock horses, King Charles Spaniel, for instance, and then a bunch of plants. There's rose, dahlia, pears, and they just cultivate the best strain, and everybody wants that one, and they unconsciously keep that one around. But he, at the end of the chapter, does make a mention that selection by man is inspired by external things in the wild, and basically it inspires them and they like that trait, so they keep it. And there are 4 circumstances for selection to best act on. So there has to be a high degree of variability that selection can act on, and also there has to be a large population, because the greater population is the greater chance you're going to have a variation to act on. Also, the species or variation needs to be useful to man, so that the men around cultivating these plants or animals see this trait and they want to keep it around. So that's when variation gets locked into a species, and there's more prevalent instances of this variation arising in future descendants. And then also animals of separate sexes must be kept separate to prevent crosses to create a new species. So you want to keep your females and males separate until you decide which ones you want to breed. This was explained in cats, donkeys, peacocks. There's not many species of those due to one of the 4 reasons being met. However, because pigeons meet all of those reasons and they mate for life, they're propagated easily, then they're highly studied as why these 4 reasons are so prevalent in selection to act on. So in conclusion, reproductive system is the highest cause of variability, and that the intercrossing of species has played a part in domestic selection, but it was not that important. It was more exaggerated, and that selection is methodically and unconsciously like the way that predominantly these new species and variations stay in the gene pool.
So the main point that Darwin is trying to make in this chapter is that variation within a species is common, especially under domestication, and it can even be shaped by selective breeding. He argues that the amount of changes humans have been able to create in both animals and plants are evidence that significant variation does exist, and that this variation can respond to selection over time. So to support that, one of the very first examples he gives is actually pigeons. There's dozens of different pigeon breeds, but some have huge tail fans, others may have puffed up chest, and some actually tumble midair. But despite how different they look, Darwin points out that they'll come from one wild species, which would be the rock pigeon. So breeders were able to pick out certain traits that they liked, and they passed them down. So over many generations, this leads to a very dramatic difference, even though that starting point was the same. He uses dogs in a very similar way. He compares something like a bulldog to a greyhound. They're both very clearly dogs with similar features, but they've been bred for completely different purposes. One would be bred for strength, the other one would be bred for speed. This kind of selective pressure mirrors exactly what Darwin believes nature does, just without the human guidance or intervention. So then he also brought up another example, which was plants. The example he gives in our chapter is the cabbage family. It's kind of wild to realize that things like broccoli, cauliflower, kale, and Brussels sprouts, they actually all came from the same plant species, but through the process of cultivation, farmers were able to shape those plants and emphasize different parts of the plants. So for like kale, for instance, it would be emphasizing the leaves, and for cauliflower, it would be the flower buds. So these are all examples that reinforce Darwin's key idea that variation is not only present, it's also useful, inheritable, and responsive to selective pressure. If people can create this kind of change intentionally, then a similar change could happen naturally over time, just with different forces at play.
Hey everyone, my name is Paola Oliveira Nazar. I'm here to talk a little bit about how this chapter contributes to the overall idea of the mechanism of natural selection. This chapter focuses on variation. And Darwin gives a few examples of variation in different species and his ideas on it. So basically, natural selection is the mechanism for evolution and furthering a species. For natural selection to occur, there has to be some degree of variation. This change can be advantageous to a certain population at the expense of another. It just kind of helps you keep the balance of space and resources, things like food, of course. And we see variation in our everyday lives. At this point, for example, like my cat, she looks and behaves completely different than my sister's cat. She's right here. Come here. Yeah, her name is Sweetie, super cute, very sweet, love her. Yeah, completely different traits and size than my sister's cat. This chapter essentially focuses on Darwin's view of variation and how they can be traced throughout species as they evolve. This variation, he stresses, must be heritable. If not, then it absolutely won't be passed on, of course, which ties into how domestication affects the reproductive organs and how it is heavily influential in creating these new or varied organisms. Habitat also has an effect on variation of organisms. An example of this can be seen when Darwin discusses the bone density or weight of domesticated ducks. He found that compared to the wild type, the domesticated duck flew less and resorted to walking more. Furthermore, Darwin also touches on artificial selection in his Selection by Man section in chapter 1, and how this also creates variation in organisms. He specifically touches on domesticated pigeons and how they have evolved to have differences in things like wing size, beaks, and plumage. Another example of this would be domesticated dogs. We have seen dogs be designed or bred for different purposes, like hunting dogs, for example, even aesthetically pleasing dogs like show dogs. And to finalize my point, modern science has allowed us to create more variation in different organisms, but to what extent should we be using this manipulation? An example I think about a lot would be like designer babies. There was a pretty controversial topic a few years ago. While we'd want a healthy child, but can we limit the other features that folks would want to manipulate, you know? And another question is, would having a child with a disability be really that bad, you know? Also, pugs and Frenchies, they're super cute, but in my opinion, they struggle too much in terms of breathing, and it's not fair to them to suffer like that because humankind wanted a certain look for the animal, you know, something aesthetically pleasing and cute. Yeah. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Asia, and I'm talking about the variation and how it relates to different examples. And so one example that I think that it relates very well to is like humans. And when I say humans, I mean our traits and the things that we inherit over time. We inherit things from our mother and our father, and they create different patterns. And as Darwin stated, that over time, these differences add up into a big change. And so I think we see those changes within different generations as far as kids, grandkids. We see those over time. And another thing that I think relates well is also when we see in social media as far as algorithm, and as we like different things on social media, over time that tends to conquer our feed, and we solely see that because over time it has made this big change of that is what we're consuming.
Whew, that was a lot. But now that all has been said, do you see why Darwin made these particular points? Well, if you said anything like he correctly observed a species, then you're correct. Do you understand why relations to these species were specifically correlated to other groups? It's because Darwin shaped the future. These ideas are very rational over the bigger picture. The idea of evolution cannot be without overbearing circumstances. Adaptations have to be made. Some of the species may be lost. Better genes might be transferred for a better chance at survival. Do you have any questions that relates to variation and domestication on chapter 1? Woo, that was a lot. But now that all has been said, do you see why Darwin made these particular points?